Okay, welcome everyone. We're just going to get started in a moment. We're just starting the live YouTube stream. Welcome to everyone that's joining us there. I see people coming in now, attendees. Thanks for registering and joining us live. We're just going to get started in one moment. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Derek Auger, the Executive Director of Conservatory Canada. And today I'm coming to you from a different location. I know those of you that check in every Friday, you can see my background's a little bit different. I'm actually at the head office for Conservatory Canada in London, Ontario today, rather than my home studio or my home office in Thunder Bay. And so it's a pleasure to join you here for the first time from London itself. I can tell you everything at the Conservatory is going wonderfully here in London. And we're very excited to have today's guest, Dr. Gilles Comeau, with us. I'll just give you a little idea. I'm sorry I couldn't get an email out this week with my travels, but I'll hit you all with an email early next week to give you an updated webinar schedule for everything coming up. We have our next wave of guests coming in before the Christmas holiday. And so next Friday, actually, Christopher Norton's going to join us to talk to us, to give us a repertoire session about some of the grade 9 and 10 repertoire out there that he's written more recently and has been published more recently. And then on December 2nd, we're joined again by Cécile Desrosiers and Eleanor Gummer, who are going to talk to us more about music from women composers. And I'll give you more details on that in the email next week. And then on December 9th, I have confirmed that Deborah Wanless is going to join us for a repertoire session on music for one hand. So that should be very interesting. And then I believe beyond that, we're going to break for a little bit for the Christmas holiday. And so that just gives you an idea of what's coming up over the next 3 weeks for those of you that like to join us all of the time every Friday here live on Zoom. Thanks for registering. Of course, you can watch these live on our YouTube channel, CCTV, Conservatory Canada TV, anytime. And that's where the replays live. I know a lot of you are probably getting familiar with that CCTV channel now. You're seeing how it works. You're seeing how the playlists work so that you can sift through the many, many sessions that are on there that you can find. You can find exactly what you want. So I'm going to introduce today's guest. Dr. Gilles Comeau is the professor of the piano lab at the University of Ottawa. He's also going to talk about a new initiative that he is a director of through the University of Ottawa that centers around music and health and wellness and reaching out to the community. Him and I have had a discussion about that already, and I find it very fascinating. And so he's going to talk to us today about music research, pedagogy research specifically, I think, based on the piano, some of the things he's finding in his lab with the many people that have come in, some of the students that are working on some of this research, and why it's important for studio teachers to perhaps pay attention to this. I know I've always been fascinated by it. I'm always trying to find more about research, and I find it kind of difficult. And so something that we're going to try and start, and you've seen a little shift lately, is a little bit more bringing guests in, talking about this research so it can inform and sculpt our teaching a little bit, our habits, so we can change the way we're working and operating with kids and always continue evolving. And I know that's the crew that we have here. Those of you that join us every Friday, you're curious about that process. And so we're happy to bring these types of sessions to you. And I know you're going to find this very interesting today. So Dr. Gilles, thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to let you take it away here and enlighten us as to what's happening in music research from what you're seeing lately.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to get the opportunity to share the work that we do in my research lab and to be able to communicate with music teachers and be able to share the type of work that we do. So thank you. It's very, very much appreciated. And I will start right away by sharing my screen. And we will get ready. So we should be fine now. So basically, I will specifically talk about the research work that we have been conducting over the last 20 years at the Piano Research Lab. So what you see now is the main studio of the research lab where I worked. And today the presentation will be specifically about why should some of that research be of interest to music teachers. A lot of our research has centered on piano. It has been increased to include other instruments over the years. So I will also mention what we do. So I've been very fortunate in the early 2000 to have the opportunity to apply for a large grant to set up a piano pedagogy research laboratory, something that we didn't had. As you know, there are many research labs for other disciplines, so we do study how mathematics is being learned and how French or language, or so there's many research lab that looked at how children and teenagers are learning the different disciplines. But we didn't really had a research lab that would look at how piano teaching is happening, how learning is taking place, and what are the benefits, and what could explain actually how we could improve at times or better knowledge of piano pedagogy. This is really why this lab was set up, and this is really what we've been dedicated our time and research over the last 20 years. So I'm happy to share that. Here it gives you other rooms of the research lab that we have, the technology that we have, the period instruments that we have with clavichords and pianofortes, the video conferencing capabilities, because we've done a lot of distance teaching as well. So this gives you in a nutshell the different people that are involved for various aspects of the research that we do. I thought we would start our conversation today by looking at one particular topic, motivation. As you know, as music teachers, we observe a very high dropout rate. When we look at some unofficial statistics, we see that many children starts and there's a big dropout rate after the first year or during the year. So many are not coming back for a second year. And then there is also another dropout rate after the second year. And there's another big dropout rate when they enter high school. So we did look at what was the aspect of motivation and wanted to understand what could be the factors that could really affect motivations. And what we were looking at is a theory in motivation that looks at the different types of motivation, from amotivation, where you're not at all interested, to some type of regulated motivation, where you're motivated, but you need to have people around you that kind of enforce it to have a fully internal type of motivation, where you're very much engaged and enjoy doing it, and that is for yourself. So we are all somewhere along that spectrum, and that can change over time. And we wanted to know what were the factors that was contributing to developing internal motivation and a type of motivation where you would continue to practice music. And we looked at some factors, the age of starting lessons, were we seeing any effect on the level of motivation, the gender, being we were working with children, so being male or female, the method that was being used. So here we did had children that were in the Suzuki method, others were in the Yamaha method, and others were in the common conventional method. So various other methods were being used. We did look at private lessons and also group lessons to see if people who also have group lessons on top of their private lessons, it would make a difference, or just group lessons. For example, in Yamaha, they would have group lessons. In Suzuki, they would often have a private and a group lessons, or the most common one would be just private lessons. We wanted to know if exams and competition were creating some effect on motivation. And we wanted to know if parental involvement was having an effect on the level of motivation. These was done through surveys with children from the age of 6 to 17. It was conducted over a number of years, and most participants covered the province of Quebec, the province of Ontario, a part of Western Canada, and all of New England, always in the States. We also compared comparative studies with children in China. So we had 2 sessions of data collection in China to be able to compare Asian students with the North American students. And of all the factors that are there, there were two that has a huge impact. Actually, it was quite surprising the impact that it had on the motivation level and the development of an internal motivation. There were two that has a huge impact, and the others did not. And I will let you guess which two could it be. So I can tell you that the age of starting lesson was surprisingly very important. We found that the younger the children were starting, the more their internal motivation was increasing. And the level of increase was quite spectacular. So the ones that were starting at 4, 5, 6, 7, even 7 years old would have a much steeper level of increase in terms of motivation. And we found that generally speaking, on average, the one that starts at 8 years old and after, the level of motivation tend to diminish. It is very hard for children who would begin piano lesson at a more advanced age, like 7 or 8, to develop a deep internal motivation. And we see the motivation that has a big tendency to drop, and also a bigger dropping rate. So that was quite surprising. And we looked at various other confounding factors, and really age of starting lesson was a very strong indication. So it tells us that, yes, if you are able to start children very young and get them involved, they will increase their participation to the instruments and will help the development of that internal motivation. And if you have a student that starts at a later age, well, you have to take extra, be involved in extra ways to really maintain their motivation, because you know that that is really at risk. None of the other factors underneath had any impact on the motivation level of participants except parental involvement. So in other words, we didn't see difference between boys and girls in terms of their motivation level. We didn't see much difference between the method. So children that were in any of the approach I've mentioned could have strong or weak motivation. We did not see in our studies a difference when groups lessons were involved or not. Children could like group lessons as opposed to just private lessons, but it was not showing in their motivation. Exams and competition were showing an increase of practice in the weeks or months before the exam or the competition, but that was not translating into development of more motivation. It had other impact, but we're studying here just the motivation. And then for parental involvement, that was the biggest factor that was contributing to motivation. And here we were looking at two things. We were looking at parents who would sit in during the lesson and often participate or take notes or ask questions. That was the factor that has the strongest impact. And sitting in at home. So we were measuring how many times do you sit in for practice? Do you stay for the whole practice, etc. And that was by far the strongest factor that made students continue and that developed that internal motivation that we are all interested in. So that was quite good, even when children were saying, oh, I don't like my parents to be there, or I don't like my parents, they're always there and telling me what to do. In spite of that, when we had the questions that was looking specifically at the development of their internal motivation, there was an increase of that motivation to know that the parent was there and was supporting what was happening, and that was quite important. That was confirming other studies that we know, for example, about schoolwork. We know that children that gets home and have parental support to do their assignments at home, their homework, will develop usually a much stronger motivation towards school activities. And the same thing with parents who gets involved in school's activities. So those children gets much more motivated for school activities. So basically here we had a similar confirmation, and it was quite strong in terms of how you can improve and works towards motivation level. We did some work on another big element that music teachers find important, and that one is how many symbols do you need to know to be musically literate? That's the first questions we asked when we were looking at music reading. And I would be asking you that same questions today. Try to think for yourself. You're a music teacher and you have to teach your students to read music. What and how much does he need to learn to be able to become musically literate? Do you have to teach him 25 symbols, 50 symbols, 150, 200s, 400s? How many musical symbols are you responsible to teach your students to make sure that they become musically literate? That question was asked very early on when I started to be interested in music reading research. I work with people that are doing similar research, but for learning to read language, so to learn to read text. And I found out that those researchers know exactly, well, of course, if we are talking about the reading French or English text, we know exactly how many letters, we have to teach those, we know exactly how many phonemes we can build with those letters. We know how many syllables a child can read at 4 or at 5 or at 6. We know how we increase that. So we have all those numbers, and we even have the average for each child, depending if they are preschoolers or grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3. But in music, we didn't have any idea. So we started to ask ourselves, okay, what is it where we have symbols and concepts related to music reading? How could we know how many there are to teach and how we should do? So what we did was to take many music books, basically piano method books, and looked at them from page to page, all the primers of the different method books, and calculate how many symbols were introduced to know how much content there was related to music reading in the different method books. We did it for the North American method books. We did it before when the method books were still mainly published by big publishers. Recently, we've had more and more method books coming on. So our study probably stops around 2015, everything that had been published around that time. And we did both the North American method books, but also the European method books to try to see if there was a difference. And I was asking you earlier, how many symbols do you think you would have to teach your student? Was it 50? Was it 200? Was it 400? So here's the results that we got from different method books. And you will be able to see some of the method books that you're probably familiar with. And you will be able to see in the last column how many symbols and concepts they are teaching through their methods. Now, for the early ones, Music for Little Mozart's, ABC, and Music Road, we have much smaller numbers. And I think that that can easily be explained because this is usually geared for much younger students, often of the very beginner at a young age. And they probably made a choice of limiting the number of musical sign or symbols they would have. But then you can see from all the other books how there's quite a disparity. And if you decide to use with your students music pathways, well, at the end of all the primer books, you would have introduced 138 symbols. And if you use Bastien, the 1985 method books, you would have introduced almost 200 symbols. And if you use Alfred's basic piano library, it would be about 262. So you're probably not aware when you make a choice for one particular method book or another, that you are also making a choice about the number of symbols that will be introduced through that methods. And we found that it was particularly interesting and revealing to see the disparity between the different method books and to see how much some methods were introducing and how little some other methods were introducing. Then we started to ask ourselves, but what's the ideal number? Is 100 enough? Is 168 better? Is 200 too many for young children? So we have not answered those questions yet, but all we know is that the different methods are targeting a number that is quite considerably different from one method book to the other. We've done calculations of when the new symbols are introduced and how often. So is it normally one new signs per page on average, or is it 3 per page, or 1 every 5 page? So that is probably having a huge impact on the learning process, because we know that we take time to assimilate certain things. More importantly, it's very important to see how the symbols, when they're introduced, how often they are repeated for reinforcement of those different symbols. I will give you an example. We saw that in some of the method books, they introduced the staccato. And then they have 2 or 3 pages where the student will play with staccato. And then the staccato is gone for 20, 25 pages, doesn't reappear in any piece. And then the dotted half note appears, where we have a dot, but it means something else. And then 10 pages later, oops, the staccato arrived and the student doesn't remember and is confused. And the teacher said, yes, but we've seen that before. We've taught you that, you don't remember, etc. That has all to do with the constant reinforcement, something that is being taught and then put aside for an extended period of time tends to not be really learned. It was learned and forgotten and didn't have the necessary reinforcement to be carried on in the learning. And it becomes even more confusing if there was a confounding symbol that will introduce in the middle that was similar or meant something different, but was still a dot, for example. So we found that very often the method books, many of them were doing poorly on how they would reinforce those different symbols that were introduced and how they were careful of never letting them go, but finding ways to bring them back up. We then found that in many, many method books, the fingers that were required to play in the early method books is the thumb, by far, is the finger that will play the most, and then the second and the third finger, which is probably making sense in terms of our repertoire, and sometimes the same in the left hand. But we all know that finger 4 or 5 are probably the fingers that needs to be most activated or most practiced. We found that at the end of some primers, and the primers are sometimes 4 books or 6 books, 4 books, certainly. We found that at the end of the primers, sometimes the child will have played with their thumb or with their number 2 350 times throughout the different pieces. That's if they repeat each one once. Of course, it would be more because they repeat the pieces. But they would have played with finger 4 or 5 25 times, for example. So in a way, sometimes the way our method books are constructed, they emphasize the playing of the stronger fingers, and the ones that could be more practiced or make more use of, or not part of the repertoire that are given to read in the primer book. So we found quite a few of those things. Similarly, we found that the note, not surprisingly, for example, in the treble clef from C to G, are repeated hundreds of times in the primers, and then the notes A and B and C, which are starting to be weaker notes when you do music reading, or just touch upon when you get to the end of the primer. So sometimes we kind of are surprised that there's more difficulty to read an A or read a C in the third space, and we have emphasized that through our method book. So those are the kind of studies that research does to be able to understand what happens when we use certain method books and how are they built and what do they develop and what do we get at the end and what are we not familiar with. So there's quite a disparity between all of them. Then we found that some methods put emphasis on pattern. They teach you about recognizing chords and being able to play chords, or recognizing a broken arpeggios, and others put emphasis more on single notes, for example. So the concept being introduced are also quite different. So those are some of the works that we have done on method books to try to understand what's happening, and also to help teachers become more aware of those things, so that when they choose a method book and when they work with a child with a particular method book, they know that they can be critical about what's happening and what is not happening, and they can supplement with that even in the early stages with the primer books.
Gilles, I just want to interrupt for just a moment here. I'm wondering, okay, your camera was frozen for a bit, now it's okay. So I just wanted to make sure that the slide you have right now is the same one, total number of symbols and concepts in American piano methods.
Yes, it is. I will change it now. Tell me if you see the new one.
Yeah, no, okay, that's good. I just noticed your camera was frozen, so I just wanted to make sure that not everything was frozen there. Go ahead. This is great.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. The other thing that we've looked at was the sight reading, because we know that for many teachers, the sight reading is always the thing that we feel that can be very hard to work with some students. In fact, I often says that if I'm addressing a group of music teachers live in a room, I often say that if I had a piece with a little text that needed to be read, and I ask if there was anyone in the room that would be willing to read the text for me, there are many people who will volunteer. They will raise their hand, they will take the paper, and will be happy to read the little text. And if I say, I now have a little music excerpt that I'd like someone to play on the piano, do I have volunteers? Where I have a lot less volunteers. People suddenly look down, look around, and you have the few teachers who are very gifted sight readers or have great skills will be happy to volunteer. And the majority, even after years of musical training and years of teaching, don't feel as comfortable to go and sight read a musical text as we are with sight reading words in a text. So there is a questions about what's happening with sight reading, and we have not studied it very much. And one of the first questions we looked at was the idea of the importance of reading ahead. So as many have, I was taught that it's important for sight reading to always move your eyes ahead and move it as far as you can and never look back. That was the worst thing that we were told. And I was also given practice where they would hide notes ahead of time, so it would force my eyes to go forward. So we wanted to know what is actually happening with very good sight readers, people that are outstanding at sight readings. We've used the technique of eye tracking. Basically, this is just a little light helmet that you put on your head, and you have two cameras that looks at the movement of your eyes, and those are synchronized with what's on the screen. And what is on the screen is the text of the musical score. And you can see exactly where the eyes are going. So we could see if when a note was being played in the sight reading excerpts, if the eyes are looking at the note, 3 notes ahead, 1 bar ahead, if they're going backwards. So we tested some of the best sight readers we knew, some people that are known to be able to even take an orchestra score and compress it as they sight read, some people that have been accompanists. So we were really testing the expert in sight reading. And then we also looked at some novice. And for novice here, those would be university student that we compare with the experts. So what we found was very different than what we were expecting. We wanted to know what was the distance between what the eye was looking at and what the finger was playing. So in other words, were they looking ahead a lot or not? And what we found was that with novice pianists, and again, those are not children, those are university students, they were looking about 1, sometimes 2 beats ahead of what the hand was playing. So you're playing here, they look at 1 beat or maybe 2 beats of what the hand is playing ahead. We found that experts pianists tended to do between 2 beats and 3 beats. We rarely seen an expert pianist go as far as 4 beats ahead. It was usually in the range of 2 to 3 beats ahead. So there was not that expectation that they would look ahead at what was happening. The eye was moving very systematically 2 or 3 beats ahead. That could be more than 1 note. You could have 2, 3, even 4 or 16th notes in a beat, but that's about the distance that they were looking at. So very different than the idea that they would look ahead. And both the expert and the novice would often, at the end of a phrase, look up to the end of the phrasing and had a tendency to wait before looking at the other phrase. So the number of beats ahead decreased the closer you get to the end of a phrasing. And we also found that the expert players will look back at what has been played. So I'm playing here, I'm looking here. When I play here, my eyes will go back to look at what was played. So the eyes are constantly coming back at different points as we do the reading, most likely because the brain is testing to see if what you have played corresponds to what was written there. So it's kind of a natural way to check ourselves. We do that with words as well. So it's the idea that you would go back just to make sure, and it can be quite unconscious. You're not necessarily aware that you're doing that, but this is the trend that we saw with the eyesight. Now, it's important to know that the way the eyes work, there's only the fovea, which covers about 15% of your black dot in the eyes. There's only that part of the eye that has clear vision enough to be able to read. The rest is peripheral vision, so it gives you an idea of what's around, but it's foggy, it's not precise. So it's really the middle of the fovea that have to look specifically at the notes to be able to decode it. So this is why we can know where it goes. And you don't control the movement of your eyes. Your eyes moves about 4 to 5 times a second. So the eyes is constantly jumping around and making a construction of what is out there. So when we're looking here, we're not looking at the musician who trained his eyesight. We're looking at how is the brain working to be able to make an interpretation of the reading that is going on. And what we're finding is that that number of beats ahead is much smaller than what some of us would have believed. So that was quite interesting to find that kind of work. I also remember that when I was a student, they were training us in sight reading to be able to look at the bass line first and then cover all the way up to the treble clef. And they would often have us read some Bach chorale and sometimes even broken to increase our sight reading and always starting from the bottom. When we look at expert readers in music, they barely looked at the bass line. Most of the eyesights are in the treble clef, and they just use the peripheral vision to be able to look at the bottom line, and they guess what is there with their knowledge of music. And what we found that is the difference between a novice and an expert is really the ability for the expert to be able to make sense of what's out there with the notation. The expert does not read individual notes, but read package of note. This is a chord, this is this interval, this is that, this is that. Everything kinds of makes sense. So what is the difference between a novice and an expert? I would say that the novice is like reading more or less syllables per syllables, while the experts are reading words. We see the same thing in text reading. When someone starts in school, they will be reading with syllables and with pause and with stop when a word is much harder. They will do that for quite some time. The expert does no longer read syllables per syllables. They are able to grasp the words as they go through. And the eyes will also, when you read through a text, skip over all the articles, the, like the is never, there's never an eye contact with that. You just jump and you move forward. We see the same thing in music. So the way to increase reading is really by increasing the ability to construct meaning with the notes and to construct pattern, as opposed to be able to read from note to note. And it's very interesting to see that while everybody talks about the importance of reading patterns and getting patterns, we see next to nothing in terms of sight reading books about how to decode a music text by looking at pattern and seeing all the pattern as you go through and teaching that, so that you have one pattern and you say it's all over the piece and try to see it as you go through, and then another pattern, as opposed to have us try to read as we go through. Some sight reading books mention that in the beginning, but the method is not paced, and there's no strategies where a pattern is introduced and then the musical excerpts that needs to be played has that pattern numerous times, so that you train the eye to see those patterns. And that's really the big difference between the novice and that expert, is that the experts see words all the time. They see what's there. And if you remove the text, they can go a bit longer, and sometimes even go longer than what their eyesight was able to see. Because of their musical training, they can guess what is coming after. So it is that ability to see the meaning of the group of notes and the structure of the phrase that improves your reading ability much more than anything you do in looking ahead or not looking back or measuring that. So that was a very interesting study that we were able to do, and got some good surprised information. Now, even closer to what you deal with on a daily basis, we were wondering what was the impact of the colorful illustration in method books. If you look at the early method books, Aaron and John Thompson, the early books of the 1900 up to the middle, the 50s, 1950, they were a lot less illustration, and it was black and white, just a black thing, because there were little colors. And then around the 50s, we saw one color, sometime two, being introduced. But now, as you know, the books are filled with very, very colorful illustration on the method books. And there has been very little study that has been done to try to analyze what is the impact on those method books. Comparatively to that, when you have a primer to teach text reading in schools, numerous studies have been done to try to understand what is the impact of pictures. And they know that in a text, the pictures needs to be very closely related to the content. It should be put at that place. It should not be bigger than that size, etc. There's a lot of information on how to put illustration in a primer to teach text reading. But in music reading, we've mainly covered our primers with lots and lots of pictures without never asking what was the impact of it. Of course, the book is more colorful, so it will attract the eyesight, and it's nice to have a beautiful illustrated book for a student or even for a teacher who has to pick up a book in a bookstore. The colorful illustration will often be a big incentive related to that. But from the pedagogical point, from the learning aspect of it, what is the impact of the color method books? We use the same technique that we had used before. So the eye tracking, where we see where the eye is looking at, where it is focusing. And again, it is not where you're consciously looking at. It is more where your eyesight is jumping, which means that you have parts of your neurons that are activated to be able to get that information. And it could be that if you're reading a piece of music, the eyesight will look at the nice illustration there, and then will bring it back to your brain, and your brain will say, no, that's not relevant. So you forget it and you go there. You might not be aware of that, but there is a lot of energy and activity that goes on brain-wise to be able to make sense of what you need to remember, where your eyes should go, how is it related, etc. So as you know, method books could have lots of pictures. You have two examples here. In one of the pictures, let's say the second one, if I had a wish, you can see that the pictures cover almost 2/3 of the page. And if you're a child, there's nothing less interesting in that page than the music score at the bottom. The top part is so exciting and so beautiful. In the first example, this is even different, and that happens more and more in method books. Even the musical score is put on a background that is colorful. And here we know what is the impact. We know how the eyes will work when black notation is written on a white background as opposed to written on colorful illustration. And you could look in many of the method books that are out there in the in bookstores. More and more have a background in music for music notation. We don't see that in primer that teach text reading, because we know that the fovea works with clear contrast with black on white. We also know that black is the universal color for music writing, and that is not just by chance. It's because having experience with various ink color and processes, there are strong indication that it is very clear black ink on a white color that works for reading text. That knowledge that we have has not always made its way into the musical text that we used. So I thought I would show you what it looks like when the eyes are moving around a music score, so that you can see where a student is giving attention with the jumping of his eyes. And you will see sometimes the eyes or the little dot that shows the eyes is going down. That's because they're looking at their hands, so they're off the musical score. But otherwise, you see the eyes moving on the score. This is being recorded, and then we can test and analyze that. So that's why I can show you that today. So what I will do is that I'll start that. There's no sound. It is just the movement of one of the eyesight. So here you could see how the dot was moving. You could see where the student was looking. This is quite a good student here, and you will understand why. And you could see how the eyes was attracted quite a few times to the ice cream man in the corner, and after that through the sundae on the side. So the eyes was going there. I will also bring your attention to the background when I was telling you that there are stripes of colors in the background, and the way this is distributed. This tends to go against what we know about the best way to include black on white background for reading. So now I will show you the same score, and you will see some blue dots on the score, and those blue dots are every places where there has been a fixation, where the eyes went there, the eyes went there, the eyes went there, the eyes went there. So you will see where are the fixation, and the size of that circle will represent in millisecond the duration that the eye was on the different places. So if you look here, you can see that there are some circles at the beginning, looking at the title, etc., looking around, looking at what is coming. In the last bar, the first line, there's a lot of circle because the left hand is hard to read there. So you see a lot of that. You also see that the dots rarely are right on the notes, because when we read music, looking at the black dot doesn't tell us anything. It's where that black dot is situated. So we always looked around the black dot to be able to get a recognition of that. But you can see that there are a lot of dots also on the ice cream man, and many on the sundae, and quite a few on the cherries as well at the bottom. And what we find is that the cognitive reserve, the cognitive attention is spread between looking at the score and looking at the picture. And all of that comes to the brain, and then the brain decide what it wants to bring to your conscious, and what it decide is not as important. So you're not aware necessarily that you look at the sundae while you play, but your brain is making a lot of work to be able to look, bring that in, store that away, and then bring back your attention to the notes. And we found, not surprisingly, that when we have a child who is very focused and good on reading, they're quite able to maintain their eyesight on the notes, and they're not too distracted. And when you watch the previous slides, I told you it was a good student. That student was quite good. Just a few, three times on the ice cream, 3-4 times on the man, and lots of time looking at their hands. But the more the child is inattentive or is a little bit hyper, the more the eyes are going into all kinds of directions. And what we do is that we compare a score like this, where we have pictures and notation, to another score that would have all the pictures and the color removed and just the notation. And what we find out in those moments is that when there is just the notation, about 98% of the eyesight or on the score. Nothing goes around. They are entirely on the score. But when you have a score with some pictures, it is between 5 and 20% of the eye fixation that will go there. And the more active your students can be, the closer he is to the 20%. So it's often the poor reader that is the most affected by the impact of pictures. So that is a big thing to remember, that I know that pictures are great, but I also know that it has an impact. A good word to say is that usually conservatory syllabus and material have no pictures, and while they might have stayed away from pictures for all kinds of reasons, there is a real benefit for the reading aspect of it. And with method books, I'm often asked, well, what should we do? Well, the pictures are really, really nice, but maybe it would be better to have a picture on one side like we have in children's books, and then the text could be separated. So you could just have the music on one side, but the picture would be there, and you can hide the picture when you do that. There would be ways of introducing that where the pictures is not a hindrance to the process of music reading. Then there is the other aspect that we've looked at, which is music dyslexia, which could be quite a common problem, especially because we're dealing with young children and what we call vergence, where the eyesight is reaches perfect location and can look at two things and make just one picture and nothing blurred. This takes time, and about 50% of children have reached that maturity by their times they're 5 or 6 years old, but the other 50 will take another 4 or 5 years So we have more at 6, more at 7. And by the time a child is at 11, 10, 11, most people have reached good control over the vergence of the eyesight. But because we start young children at 5 or 6, there could be a number of them where that is not clear yet. And they don't know because they've never seen differently than what they see. So things could be, to us, a little bit blurred, a little bit different, a little bit foggy, or there could be double vision. There are all kinds of things that can happen. And it does not make difference for anything we do on daily life. But when you look at the music score and you have 5 lines that are the same, and you have a tiny little black dot that can be on different things, if your vision is not perfect, you just don't know. It moves. It could be the line, it could be the space, it could be you just get lost. So there are cases of dyslexia that could be caused by that. There is also now conditions that we call music dyslexia that is different than the kind of dyslexia you have with words, or the kind of dyslexia we have with numbers, for example. So there are people that can be very musical and can play quite well, sometimes at an advanced level by on their instruments. They can play by ear, but have a lot of difficulty when it comes to music reading. And we found that mainly with studies with university students that are playing usually brass instruments or wind instruments. They would have started their instruments when they were in grade 7, grade 8 at school, maybe even high school. So they were old enough to be able to find strategies to hide the fact that reading was not making any sense to them. So they would write the name of the notes, they would practice, they would memorize their line, and they were fine. Things progress slowly in schools, and they only had one piece of learning. And we got students who were admitted at the university with a phenomenal ear, were very good at performing, were playing at a high level, and then got into solfège and failed. And they failed not because they didn't have a good ear, but they could just not read music. And that's often how we detect that. So you can reach a very high level of music competency, but have a music dyslexia. So you can look at the various things that are related to that. In music, we've had a very good way of telling students who cannot read, you don't practice enough, you don't listen, you don't pay attention. And our students with music dyslexia would stop lessons after the first or second year because they were just not getting it. We were not trained really to see that we could have a child with dyslexia where music reading is absolutely not making any sense for them, and it could take times for them to be able to deal with dyslexia. And if there is one instrument where it's really difficult if you have music dyslexia, it's certainly piano, because the reading has 2 staff and it's quite difficult. There are a number of books, especially in UK, that have been written now by the associations of parents for students with music dyslexia that produce all kinds of little tips of how to deal with dyslexia. Some students need to have the 5 lines in different colors or have the middle line red. So if there's a dot, they know if it's about the 3rd line or below the 3rd line. There are ways of, many students will read a 1 line and get at the end, they come back and they don't know where to go. So all kinds of things to help with that. And we're now trying to find if we could develop a test to measure music dyslexia, know what kind they could have, and be able to help. Music dyslexia could be found with children that have text dyslexia at school, and very often children that have text dyslexia will also show difficulty with music reading. But the two are not necessarily related. And there are quite a number of musicians nowadays and students who are struggling with music dyslexia. and have no problem reading text. There's actually some composers that decided to stop performing and went into composition and use a lot of electronic instruments because they just couldn't cope with the music reading. And there are quite a few, surprisingly, quite a few people still playing in orchestra nowadays who hide the fact that this is a real problem for them. So it's something that we have to be very careful with when we work with students, because it is a difficulty that is there. And in the past, all we had to say was, why don't you be able to read? Or why don't you see what's there? Or we've covered that last week, or you're just not practicing enough. Maybe you should start music lessons. If we were able to make such big steps in terms of text reading with dyslexia is because being at school is compulsory. At the time of my grandmother, those who had music dyslexia, text dyslexia, were not going past grade 1. When my mother was at school, there were some that had huge difficulty with reading. They could usually cope for 2-3 years, but then they would drop and they were not able to continue and are still not able to read. I had an uncle who, even after 3 years in school, try a 4th year, were just not able to make sense of letters. Nowadays, people with text dyslexia can finish university. We have found ways to help those students because we are forced to keep them in school, so we have to find tools to work with them. Unfortunately, in music, it is not the same way. So when we have children who have that difficulty, they usually drop music, or we strongly recommend that they do another activity instead of music, because we have the feeling that they don't practice enough or they don't pay attention enough to music reading. So just being aware that this is a condition and that it is on a continuum. So it's not that you have it or you don't have it. You are somewhere on a continuum. So it could be very light, it could be medium, it could be very accentuated. So the question is always, as music teachers, how do we deal with musical dyslexia? And the first thing is certainly to recognize that it could be a condition and that you could see many of the students with that. Next things, we started to work with children that had a pain, that were deaf at a very young age. We see children that wants to do musical instruments, and piano was usually the instruments that were recommended to them. So when I arrived at the University of Ottawa more than 20 years ago, the University of Ottawa was one of the first hospital that were doing implantation of cochlear mechanism to babies, to people before the age of 2. It was still very controversial. Today it's the norm, but it was still very controversial. And many parents who wanted their child to have cochlear implants were moving to Ottawa. So they were coming from Toronto, from Montreal. So there was a lot of young children at that time who were starting to learn to talk and hear with their cochlear implant. And by the time they were 5 or 6, parents started to ask for music lessons for them. So our lab was very much involved in teaching piano to those children and to do some testing to see how it would impact their brain activities. So these are sensors that looks at how the neurons are firing and moving if you're deaf and if you are learning to play a musical instruments. And in the early days, we had a group of children that work in particular with a teacher for a period of 5 or 6 months. And then at the end of that 6 months, there was a piano recital with various children, and the children that were deaf also participated. So this will be a recording of them. So those children, when they say if it's bilateral or unilateral, is do they have an implant on each side or just on one side? It's not something you need to bother, but those children were entirely deaf, and with the cochlear implant, they are able to learn to play, and this is what this is showing. It was quite an accomplishment for those children, and of course for their parents, to see that children who were born deaf were now on stage playing piano. So that gives you an indication of what those students could do. For a long time, we were only prescribing piano because the sound is made. We know that with the cochlear implant, they hear very, very differently than the way we hear, and we don't know how they perceive sound, musical sound yet, but we certainly know that they can play and can get quite advanced. But surprisingly, we got a student to audition to be in the violin program at the university. And the jury members did not notice that he had cochlear implant and was deaf until after the audition. And that goes against everything that we usually say, that a child who's deaf with cochlear implant should think of piano, certainly not of strings instruments where you have to find the pitch. Well, he was playing in pitch, and it was quite fascinating. So we're doing a big study on him and a case study and showing that it is possible through the vibrations that are detected by the body to be able to find the correct pitch on a violin and be able to learn that. So there are a lot of promises for students that are there. The last thing I will look at is pain and injury. There are so many people that are injured or feeling pain. The level of incidence is very, very high. Depending on how you ask the question, the number of professional musicians who suffer from pain and injuries goes between 50 and 80%, so 50 to 80%. But the most striking figure is that 20% of music students, those are the 18 and under, those are the students that many of us teach, 20% of them are suffering from pain and injury, where they have to consult, where they have to take physiotherapy, where they take medication, where they usually don't tell their teacher. So there is a lot of things related to pain and injury. So I thought I would finish by talking a little bit about that. And the first thing would be about the importance of warming up. And this is something that many of us are using in our studio. Let's warm up before you begin. So the first question, what does it really mean to warm up? Do you really think that the students start to play something to warm up the muscles? We wanted to know what's behind that conception that we are warming up. And we're using some thermal imaging in the early 2000s. That was quite revolutionary to bring that in a piano studio. So those studies were very much covered because of what they were able to see. So what you see with those is the temperature of the body, and the deeper the color above the skin, the warmer it is, and the whiter, the cooler it is. Nowadays, this is used often since the SARS virus. For example, when you go in an airport, you are having pictures taken through thermal imaging, and they can detect if you have a fever or not. But we use that in hospital as well for all kinds of reasons. And here, when we notice that it is a very dark color, it could mean that there is an inflammation and that there are some pain because there's more darker colors and more temperature. And when you have a white spot, it often means that the circulation is not going there because there's a notch, or there could be also a problem. And usually what we do is that we know the muscles that are in the hand, in the arms, and they are identified. And then we looked at the camera, we played that, and we are able to find what the temperature is. So the first question we had was, what happens when musicians and advanced musicians practice? And we had musicians come in and practice for an hour and a half, and we were taking pictures constantly. And we were trying to look at that phenomenon of warming up. And what we discovered was that the body and the muscles are actually not warming up at all. The body is fighting the urge of warming up because you want to maintain the same temperature. So if you look at the different muscles of the arm and the forearms, you look here that there was throughout that hour and 15 minutes of practice, a continuous cooling down of the muscle for most of them, because the body is really fighting the urge of warming up. You know that your body wants to maintain a certain temperature, and you all know that as soon as it varies by a few degrees, you don't feel well. So the body really fights against the need to warm up. So we have to be very much aware of that when we talk about warming up, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Here it's another candidate that practiced for 2 hours, and you can see that the first hour, a lot of attention was given to cool down and then to bring it back to where it was at the beginning. And those studies and many that others have done has shown the importance of not starting piano practice with demanding physical exercise. The idea that you start with scales is not in line at all with how the body works and the biomechanics of how the muscles function. And we're not the only one. There are many research labs that are confirming this. When you look at a student or anyone that will start practicing music, you would want to have scales and demanding things at the very end of the practice, so that after that demanding physical thing, the student can relax, the arms, the muscle can be put to rest. And you really want to start a practice with things that are less demanding, like sight reading, like learning to read a new piece, like learning things that are a lot less demanding physically, and build that up very gradually so that you're in line with how the body wants to work. And the example that is often given, and Fleischer, Leon Fleischer was 50 years ago advertising that often, and in his example was always, if you are a runner, who will start with the sprint at the beginning? People start by just stretching, they start to jog a little bit slowly, and gradually they will increase and they will do their sprint at the very end. And Leon Fleischer, that great pianist, was saying how that had to be converted in the way that we're also practicing on the instruments. And then Marc Durand in Montreal, who was his students, and others were sharing the same thing to the students. That importance of keeping the demanding aspect related to scale or to things that are fast, if there's a fast piece, etc., at the very end, and make sure that there is a cooling down period and a resting period after that. So our studies did confirm that, and did confirm that there was very little about the idea of warming up. We had another studies that have shown that people who get injuries is usually because they don't use the muscle of the forearm enough to play piano, and they rely on the muscle of the hand. There's no muscle in the fingers, so it would be the muscle of the hand, and those are much weaker muscles, and that's often where problems come. And the last thing with that is we were particularly interested into the immediate effect of somatic approach in workshops. You know that every music school now have workshops in body mapping, Alexander technique, Feldenkrais, and I myself have practiced many of those approaches, and I've always enjoyed going for long extended period on those approach. I value them very much. But I was concerned to the fact that very often in a workshop, students would come, they would play, the person giving the session would see, oh, there are problems, they will work with the students, they will change a few things for about 20 minutes, maybe half an hour at the most. Then the person would play again, and everybody in the room see a huge difference in their somatic and the way they move their body, and a huge difference in the sound. And we were not convinced that what was actually there. So we conducted a lot of studies to look at the things that are always said, that it's better usage, greater ease, less pain and tension, improved musical qualities, better sound. So we've conducted a number of research there in body mapping, in Alexander technique and Feldenkrais approach to be able to see if we were actually seeing those changes in the different parts of the body. And we had judges that were looking at, and we are not finding changes at that level after one session. When we take the videos of the performance before the intervention and after, and we give it to teachers in that method, other teachers, other body mapping, Alexander, they are not able to see a difference or to know which one was before and which one was after. Their decision is based on chance, and they don't hear a change in sound. So that was confirming the doubts that we had at the beginning, that there was a huge difference, and we have looked at how can we see that. So basically, this is what it would look like. We've asked music teachers, we've asked physiotherapists, we've asked doctors, we've had people in body mapping to look at two videos, and you can see, we see them on the side and the back, and one is before the intervention, one is after, and we ask them which one is the best, which one was before the intervention, which one was after, and we are at around 50%, so it means that people are guessing, really. It's not possible to tell the difference. So that was important for us to have a look at. So we continued to look at what was really the effect of those methods. And I'm happy to report that when those students are going through for a number of weeks, we're talking 10 weeks here, and we measure the before and after, we do see a difference, at least in the way the body is working. And I have a doctoral student who did finish a doctoral thesis recently, and she was looking at students who got 10 lessons in Alexander, each lesson of an hour, and were measured before when they were playing their instruments, and were measured after, and were measured 4 weeks after. And we do see a difference happening after 10 weeks, not for everyone, but for a number of them, and the difference is very real. So it's important to know that it's not magical, that it's not happening over one session. What the one session does is that it gives you an indication of what could be beneficial, and it stays in your mind. If you have pain 3 years down the road, you could say, well, I did an Alexander lesson some time ago, maybe I should go and take some. But it's important also to know that people will not correct something by just going into one workshop, and that they have to be willing to give it some time and attention and money, because those approaches are costly, over a number of weeks. And 10 weeks is usually where we start to see a difference. And in conclusion, I thought I would show you a little videos that was done. It's 2 minutes that was done about the activities in my lab. The talking is in English, is in French, sorry, but the script are written in English underneath. And if the script is too small for you to read, you'll still be able to look at what's happening, and you will see a lot of the things I've discussed today. You will see them happening in the lab in action. So let me start this. I'm sorry, this is me that has done something. I will restart.
Alors, laboratoire de piano est d'abord un laboratoire de recherche où on s'intéresse à étudier comment s'opère l'apprentissage du piano, et on s'intéresse à découvrir de nouvelles stratégies pour enseigner le piano. Dans les dernières années, on a pu découvrir qu'un facteur comme la dyslexie musicale pouvait contribuer à rendre l'apprentissage très difficile dans les premiers mois et les premières années. Donc, avec des recherches telles que celles qui sont faites dans mon laboratoire, on peut justement mettre à la disposition des enseignants de nouveaux outils permettant d'aider les enfants ayant de la difficulté avec la lecture musicale. On sait aussi qu'un nombre élevé d'enfants et d'adolescents développent des blessures ou des tensions musculaires ou des douleurs avec la pratique du jeu pianistique. Ce qu'on fait à travers nos recherches, c'est de développer comment on peut mieux comprendre ce qui se passe avec les postures, avec les mouvements, avec le jeu, et pouvoir mettre des pratiques différentes dans la façon de procéder lors des sessions de répétition au piano. Le travail qu'on fait au laboratoire permet aussi d'apporter de la musique dans de nouvelles régions qui autrement ne bénéficieraient pas de l'enseignement du piano. Nous avons pendant plusieurs années entretenu un projet avec une école à Kanjiskwalujouak, tout à fait au nord du Québec. Ça nous permettait de donner des leçons de piano à distance à un groupe d'enfants âgés entre 5 et 8 ans. Et le but est évidemment de permettre toujours à un plus grand nombre d'enfants de bénéficier des plaisirs de faire de la musique et de la joie de jouer du piano.
So thank you very much for that opportunity to share some of the work that we do and some of the passion we have for music learning and music teaching, and some of the research work that myself, but also all my graduate students, a lot of the things I was reporting is the work I have done with my master and doctoral music students in pedagogy. This is the kind of research work that we were able to do and that we're able to share. So thank you very, very much for that. And I'll leave it over to Derek.
Okay, so we have just a few questions here. And of course, if anyone has other questions, type them into the chat box, the Q&A, raise your hand feature so you can come on and ask them live if you don't want to type it out. And thanks for this, though, Dr. Comeau. It's been really informative. There are a lot of comments in the chat box. People are really favorable and excited to hear you speak on all of these wonderful topics in such detail today. Let's start with a question from the Q&A that came up a little while ago from Shoshana, who's asking, how far did you go into each method? And this came about when you were talking at the beginning about music reading.
Grade 1, when students would be ready to enter a grade 1, about a grade 1. Right. So it could fluctuate, but that was about. If they were primers and they were 4 books or 5 books or 6, we covered them all, and then sometime a little bit more to be able to reach about pre-grade 1 level. Right.
And that was to look at signs and concepts, symbols and concepts, and tallying how many were presented.
That's correct.
Someone's asking, could Dr. Comeau provide us with references?
Yes, and I saw another one that was asking for references for dyslexia. Was it references in general about the work that we do and giving them the references of the papers we have published on the different topics that I presented today? Or was it specifically books? I saw later questions about books on dyslexia. And the answer is yes, I could give you the references of all the papers that we have published, and I could also put in some of it. The papers are available, most of them, on the Piano Pedagogy Research Laboratory website. So if you go there in the resources, there are papers and they're listed there. And usually if you click on it, you get the paper and you can read it. The dyslexia book, of course, I could make a list of the ones that I know and could do that. So I could send that to Derek. I'm not sure how he would communicate that, but I could certainly send you the list of the paper we have. I could send you the list of the books on dyslexia. I could send you the link to the Piano Lab if you want to access the paper. And if you are unable to get the paper and you want it, write to me and we'll send you a PDF of the papers you want.
Okay, so I just put my email address there in the chat box for anyone that wants those resources. Reach out to me and then I'll go to Dr. Comeau and he'll provide exactly, if you could just provide a little bit more detail on what you want. That's great to know that the website for the Piano Lab has most of the papers there for free that people can download. That's novel in some ways.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just looking through here.
And if you don't find it on the website, there is a place to send an email to the Piano Lab, and they will tell you exactly on what page you will find the list of papers. Right. There are quite a few there.
Okay, and Shoshan, the same thing. If you email me, we can get those book titles to you. And then Julie is asking on the graduate music program website of U of Ottawa, PhD mentions interdisciplinary research. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, a few years ago, I developed the interdisciplinary music program where people can register for a PhD in music, and they combine another disciplines and they work on two disciplines as opposed to one. I have worked in interdisciplinary program for a long time, and right now myself, I supervise a lot of doctoral students in interdisciplinary research, but I do it with health sciences because Derek made mention of that. In the last few years, I opened the Music and Health Research Institute, which is a huge research institute at Ottawa U that covers all kinds of activities and research related to how music has benefits for health. And because of that, most of the doctoral students that I supervise right now is done in part with the health sciences. But there is, of course, the possibility to apply for the doctoral program, and some of my colleagues would supervise, and you need to have a project and you need to have another disciplines that would be involved. Could be psychology, could be neuroscience, could be different things.
And then to tag onto that, do you still offer a diploma for interested people to come and just study research part-time with you without being a doctoral student?
Yes, we do. And it's possible to take the courses. You would have to ask, because since I became director of the Institute, I'm less involved with the administration of the master and doctoral program. But I certainly, myself, I'm willing to welcome people that would register as distance students. You can register as an auditor also to courses. And if you want to register to one of my course, you could do that as an auditor as well. It's less costly, or you could do that with credits and get 3 credits. And for the piano pedagogy, it would have to be approved to see if they would do the possibility of the distance program as that. So, so the question is, yes, there's possibility, we need to discuss. And some people who likes to have courses, I teach brain and music, and I teach a course in January. I will be teaching the brain aspect of music perception, music reading, and motor learning in the context of learning musical instruments. So those are the kind of work that we do.
Right. And so it is possible for studio teachers really anywhere in Canada to connect with you to do courses online in certain cases.
It is possible to make a request. Yes, it was certainly all in place before the pandemic. And with the pandemic, everything went online. And surprisingly, now there are less things online than they were before. So we need to get that approved. But if you make a request, we would see, I would support it, and we would see how administration would work on that. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Rachel's got an interesting question here. So when the student is of the age that they can read, would off-staff reading still be necessary, or would it be beneficial to introduce the staff notation early enough?
It doesn't matter at what age you are. What the off-staff notation brought is an understanding of what the concepts are. You would be surprised at how even at 8 or 9 years old, the idea of on the line is still very confusing. If I have 2 lines on the line, well, normally it would be here, just above the line. You're sitting on the line like Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall. So that's being on the line. But for us, being on the line, it's right on the line. So those concepts are extremely confusing. So off-staff notations are always good because they give that understanding. The other thing is that off-staff notation give you a sense of reading by direction usually. So students get the sense that note reading is not just about knowing this is a C and it's here, this is a G and it's here, but that there is another sense inside of it that is important. So for those reasons, the graphic off-staff notation can be very important. And it's unfortunate that it usually stops completely when the staff arrives. There would be the possibility to continue some of it a little bit so that the idea associated with space, with note directions, with recognizing a pattern could be done both with off-staff notation while you're learning the staff notation and you see the relationship between the two.
Okay. And then Kim is asking, she has a student who is hard of hearing for voice lessons. Did you do any research on the best ways to help them to hear the pitch in order to match pitch or sing the songs with the intervals required?
We did not, but I'm pretty certain that some people have done that in Montreal, and I could put them in touch with the group that works with deaf people or hard of hearing people in Montreal. It's usually done by vibrations. It will all have to do with being able to touch the throat of the teacher and then be able to reproduce the same thing with the touch of where it is. For deaf children, it's very much about feeling the vibrations that are coming out from it because their sense of pitch, we say that a trained person with a cochlear implant can usually distinguish up to a tone difference, maybe a half tone difference. Well, it's huge half tone for us in music. And usually if you give them two notes and you say, are they the same or different, they're very good until it gets to a tone. And at a tone, most people think they're the same, and half tone, they often think they're the same. So with piano, we can work that out. But with strings, for example, it's really by feeling the vibration and then knowing at one point the vibration they get, the teacher says, it's exactly that. So they know that this is the kind of vibration they need to be able to do that. So that is one of the things that is very, very important to be able to help them feel that.
Okay, that's amazing, that work. I found that really compelling. Any other questions from anyone? If we're running up close to our usual time limit here today, and I want to thank everyone for attending here and asking your questions, giving us your attention, and to Dr. Comeau for coming on and sharing this research. It was certainly a lot, and we appreciate the detail. I'm sure you could probably do a talk on each one of those sections in a lot of detail. And I know you and I are going to chat further about music and health and wellness in the coming months, and we'd like to have you back as well to discuss that if you're up for it. So I don't see any other questions. I think we'll leave it at that for today. And Dr. Comeau, again, thanks from all of us for being here today and sharing your notes. I know we'll be in touch. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to email me, Derek, at conservatorycanada.ca. I'll pass the questions on and we'll see if you can get you the information.
Yes, certainly. And I know the person has to be put in touch with the people in Montreal. Well, of course, the only way to do that is if you go to Derek, or if you go to the Piano Pedagogy Research Lab, there is a way to send an email and the person who takes care of it would send it back to me.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for your positive comments. It's great to hear that this really landed well with you today. And I'm sure encourage other people to watch the replay. It'll be on YouTube momentarily. And hope you all have a great weekend. We'll see you next Friday, those that are able to join. And Dr. Comeau, thanks once again. Have a great week and we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. A pleasure.